Welcome to the second day's public program of Summer School. I'm very happy that we have tonight with us a lecture by Esther. We also invited Cary to act as a discussant in the program. So after the presentation, we'll have a few questions, and then we will open the floor for additional discussion. Let me just briefly read a short abstract of the presentation. The presentation will be around 40 minutes, 15 minutes. So the title of the presentation tonight is Diffused Gas, Turbulent Times Gas. Diffused gas, turbulent times gas, made in the factories of conglomerates, IG Farben, Germany, and Imperial Chemical Industries, Britain, diffused from the battlefields of the First World War and seeped into dreams and thought. In Walter Benjamin's concept, the gas of modern life is a synthesis of photographic gaseous haze, or aura, which interprets as a deposit of economic structure, political fantasy, and damp fog of imperial history, became a killing atmosphere on the front. It persisted, permeated, and poisoned the after-war, shaping production to the next 100 years. What gases and deadly historical fogs surround people today in turbulent days of war and competition, of street control and protection of private property. What protections might a human adapt to see into and through the opaque atmosphere screens? Are new gases needed to neutralize the old ones? Or is the climate too much corrupted? Just briefly, something from Esther's biography. Esther Leslie is a professor of political aesthetics at Birkbeck University of London. Her books include various studies and translations of Walter Benjamin, as well as Hollywood Fatlands, animation, critical theory, and the avant-garde, published by Verso in 2002, Synthetic Worlds, Nature Art, and the Chemical Industry in 2005. I will just mention maybe a project that just ended, which includes a research for an exhibition at Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art on the chemical industries of the northeast of England and the poetic and political significance of butter in Ireland for the Limerick Biennial held in 2020. I'll just read briefly just something to introduce Ty in the program. So Ty has an academic background in social anthropology, which he has studied both McGill University and the University of Oxford. His interests pertain most broadly to themes of landscape, dwelling, play, individuation, and phenomenological approaches to the study of art and arts practice. Briefly, Ty was with us also last year, initially as an intern in our program, but also supporting the development of the program. Overall, I'm very happy that he could be with us tonight. Esther, thank you very much for being here with us this year. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and thank you for being here. So this work comes out of thinking recently or over the past period about gases and atmospheres and smokes and visible environments. I suppose in a way it is like thinking about Benjamin's idea of the aura on the photograph. You can, in these early photographs, you see this aura deposited, and that haze, that gaseous deposit is for him a deposit of imperialism. It contains the poison gas of the battlefields to come. So partly I'm thinking about that in relation to IG Farben, German chemical industry, but also in relation to the British chemical industry, which made me return to these questions of landscape, chemical production, and militarism. So I think the argument here builds up to one which is about the ways in which these gases, these poisonous and densely visible atmospheres are, they both exist as environments, but they are also emblematic of something much beyond themselves. It's like thinking Benjamin's photographic aura on the plate that becomes the chemical warfare of war in the opposite direction. So I'm thinking of these chemical gases and pollution gases that surround us that then become a metaphorical resource for an age that is deeply involved in the production of metaphorical fogs and clouds and aura and haze. So, to begin, as suggested, thinking about the factories of these great conglomerates. IG Farben in Germany, made into a conglomerate in 1925, and its direct competitor, its first and main competitor, Imperial Chemical Industries in Britain, which is also made into a conglomerate around the same time. And these two places are established predominantly to synthesize ammonia, which will play its role in war, in chemical warfare, but then is diverted into the fertilizer industry when the short peace appears. So I just want to say a little about that context. So the gases made at IG Farben and at ICI were not just simple remakings of atmosphere, but they were the making of weaponized atmospheres, directly invented in order to compete for the land that existed beneath the layer of poisonous air. War, we know, demands killing gases. But perhaps no more or no less so than industry itself, the transformation through energy of one thing or things into other things. Through these processes, through these vast productions of materials, substances, items, and commodities, there was at one point a focus on gas. And sometimes these gases are lethal. It was the chemical industry that took on for itself the task of making gas. And Walter Benjamin draws attention to this in 1929, and he names IG Farben directly, which had 4 years before become a conglomerate, eating up all of the chemical industries, or many of the chemical industries that existed in Germany. So he writes this quote, he writes these lines, which I quote: "Pessimism all along the line, absolute mistrust in the fate of literature, mistrust in the fate of freedom, mistrust in the fate of European humanity, but 3 times mistrust in all of reconciliation between classes, between nations, between individuals, and unlimited trust only in IG Farben and the peaceful perfecting of the Air Force. But what now? What next?" So he really pulls out this sense in which, in this between the war period, there's nothing left. Everything is just an ideological smoke screen that there can be reconciliation. All of the political parties that argue for reconciliation are singing into the wind, because there is only one thing that will happen, and that is the fact that IG Farben is tasked in this peacetime with making the Air Force ready for war. So what comes? The industrial chemical mission is an elemental mission. It takes the elements and it makes something from them. A form that holds within itself all the elemental powers of nature and nature's capacity for production and destruction. So the first chemical factories turned air and water through the use of fire into explosives in order to destroy, and it turned these same things into fertilizers in order to produce exponentially. At the beginning of the 20th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, 6 German firms dominated the world market in the production and sales of a manufactured second nature in artificial dyestuffs, pharmaceuticals, chemical fertilizers, and synthetic textiles. All of these were absorbed into IG Farben. And that's their logo. Research scientists and managers' dreams of the fullest abandonment of nature took root from this point. Chemical companies exploded matter or explored matter and its properties. This matter makes histories or changes history, changes the world and what the world is and has within it. Now, IG Farben's main competitor was ICI in Britain and in the colonies. That is why it is Imperial Chemical Industries. This conglomerate had come from war. There was a factory in a small town called Billingham near Middlesbrough that had been established to produce synthetic ammonia for use in war. A farm had been chosen in a small village, what was then a small village, as the site of the chemical works, and it was known as the government nitrogen factory. In Germany, there was already synthetic ammonia, which had been developed by the Haber-Bosch process, fixing nitrogen from air and used to make explosives. Britain wanted some of that too, and needed to work out how to emulate the Haber-Bosch process. Submarine blockades meant that the British state was unable to import natural nitrate from Chile. The research took too long, and the goal was not reached before peace arrived in 1918. This small government nitrogen factory was taken over. Research continued. They tried to copy the German ammonia plant at Opaque in Ludwigshafen. As well as ensuring Britain had a supply of explosives from nitric acid, should they be required in a new war, ammonium sulfate was produced in order to make plant fertilizer, in order to make possible the feeding of the world. Left to itself, or rather to what the 19th century German scientist Justus von Liebig designated the Roveri system of agriculture, the soil would just die, would become exhausted because of the industrialized farming methods which did not replenish nutrients in soil. The physicist and chemist William Crookes argued in 1898 that the world could never consist of more than 2 billion people because there could never be enough food made for more than that. And this was a tragedy, he thought, because the possibility of endless expansion and new markets would be lost. And so they needed to find fertilizer that could artificially replenish soil and make more and more food. So a plant, a factory intended to turn ammonia into explosives in wartime was adapted in peacetime as a factory to make food. Synthesizing ammonia from atmospheric nitrogen means feeding streams of gas, streams of steam and air into gas generators that contain hot, coke-made water gas and produce a gas. These streams are purified and catalyzed and compressed and scrubbed and washed and converted. ICI's Northeastern England division, where new air, synthetic ammonia for fertilizers and chemical warfare was to be made, snatched what it could from the landscape, specifically from the solidity of rock. There was abundant liquid water in the sea around the factory, and there was abundant windy air from which nitrogen could be taken. So that very local arrangement, that local matter of wind and water, made certain economic arrangements possible and played its part in putting into shape what could be made. Nature was captured and contorted and twisted into something like itself, but not quite itself. It was very similar to the seeded cloud made by humans, which also took place for the first time at ICI at Billingham. Under cloudy skies or clouds full of rain, in an atmosphere of wind, a landscape was coaxed to give up its synthetic double that was of it and not quite like it, and which could itself cause nature to implode, and also cause the social body to split into classes, into workers, into managers, also into alphas, betas, and epsilons, because Aldous Huxley's Brave New World was a book written about his experience, effectively, when he worked as a young man at the ICI factory at Billingham. The factories came to dominate the environment in time, reaching ever higher above the environment. They poked into the clouds. Sometimes the clouds in the sky would hang on the clouds of steam emerging from the factories on dull days. So they made their own clouds and they made their own fog, which affected the environment. Brown and grey clouds, mingling with clouds in the sky and with the fog on the ground. Fog and cloud imprint themselves onto countless photographs. For as long as the factories have existed, they've made the air around them thick. Cooling towers make large fat clouds, white and thick. Nighttime photographs show sometimes deep grey clouds with orange halos around them. The factory illumination gleaming through them. Sometimes the clouds are on fire. The towers make clouds of gas and steam. These clouds make more clouds, or fog. This is what it's like to live near a factory like that, where smoke and fog mingle together to make a smog. Smog and sulfur dioxide derived from burning, for example, make condensation nuclei or cloud seeds, and these encourage a condensation at ground level, which results in opaque fogs. So these artificial, in a sense, artificial fogs come to shroud the factories and the homes around the factory. As said, it was also the case that clouds were seeded in Billingham, deliberate and real ones of rain, or more accurately, the clouds that hung high above the land were prodded and supercooled and made to release their watery contents. A film made by the Billingham ICI Film Unit in 1931 is titled Weather Experiments, and it documents the process of seeding clouds, which was for war technology a moment when weather is to be used as a weapon of war or deliberately deployed as a weapon of war. So ICI Billingham produced this thing called this dry ice, which they called dry cold as a brand name. And this film from 1931 begins with a radio announcer talking about the weather forecast. And viewers see a meteorological officer listening to the forecast from his living room. And he switches off the radio so that he can tell the audience watching the value of weather forecasts. He tells them how wind speeds are measured and wind direction monitored. He talks about inflatable balloons being launched. He talks of weather stations that are supervised. All this must be known so that the country can keep running what needs to be run, can keep producing. It's a film world where men smoke as they read the charts and teletype data is flowing in. And we see how nature does its thing, it works for us, and instruments measure it. But then the weather forecaster tells us that weather can be manipulated, that we can make the weather, that clouds can be formed by human ingenuity. And we see cylinders of dry cold running along a conveyor belt and being packaged into bags, and this is placed on aeroplanes that travel above the clouds. And in the film, 300 pounds of dry cold is released from the back of a plane, while inside the navigator records the atmospheric conditions and observes the location of the penetrated cloud and observes its watery load streaming down the windows of the aircraft. Rain has been made. ICI are weather modifiers, and they can rule the heavens. Those experiments continued or resumed, becoming part of military training. It was understood that sudden rainfall could stop an enemy, could make them sink into the mud, or stop them crossing a river. Or a sudden shower might clear fog, making things easier for our side, allowing planes to take off on an airfield. Documents can be found that speculate on rainmaking possessing the potential to explode an atomic weapon in a seeded storm system or cloud, one made in just the right place. The thought continues, if we exploded the atomic weapon inside a cloud, it would produce a far wider area of radioactive contamination than in a normal atomic explosion. So we already have the language then in the 1940s of normal atomic explosions. In August 1949, ICI worked with the Royal Air Force to generate rain through seeding clouds in a series of experiments. A training aircraft, which was based in the northeast of England, flew with a crew to drop dry cold over the northeast and over the North Sea. The observers were able to report a good shower at the cloud's base on one flight, but in other experiments there was only a light drizzle that evaporated in the air. They continued their experiments using Billingham's chemicals, and on the 15th of October 1952, they may, although it has never been admitted, have caused a flash flood in Devon, in the village of Lynmouth. Alongside some hints in official documents, unofficial reports insist that aeroplanes were circling the area before the catastrophic downpour. Whose stories? Whose histories? 35 people died in those floods, and water poured from the moor onto the village, sweeping away bridges and buildings. The squadron leader joked that the efforts to make rain, officially called Operation Cumulus, was known to those who carried it out as Operation Witch Doctor. From Billingham, a hell could be whipped up far down in the south of England, and a storm from precipitated clouds, heavy with dense particles that have been shot into its body, might drop its water load some hundreds of miles away. History is meddled with by nature. Nature is subjected to covert histories. A drought in the northeast a few years later, in 1955, again raised the issue of bringing rain to the land. The problem had come home. Billingham's ICI factory was threatened with closure, and management required aircraft to spread its own chemicals in the skies above so that they might go on making their own artificial clouds. Shortly after this, it began that work of putting atmosphere in a tin, inventing the whole spray can with air freshener and so on. Nature is remade by factory labour. It is and is not itself. There is a rift. Nature can outbid its own offering through augmentation, through synthesis. Labour too is remade by the nature that buffets it and by the factory that contains it. Earth is seeped with agrochemicals. Fertility is not natural abundance, but a result of a supplementation made necessary by soil exhaustion, which itself provides profitable business opportunities. Air is snatched in and puffed out again. This is the industrial cycle. Factories make clouds of gas. These clouds are pushed towards other factories, other lands. These clouds are weapons, these gases are weapons. Now, Walter Benjamin, or more likely his wife, Dora, who was a chemist who studied with Fritz Haber, one or both or either of them wrote of chemical gases in 1925 and afterwards. There's this extraordinary little piece, it probably is by Dora, but it's an imagination of chemical warfare to come, and the effect of these gases made by IG Farben seeping into the city. So there is no longer a battlefield defined. There's just wind carrying poisonous gases across the cities. In 1930, Dora writes a novel called Gas Against Gas, which is a sort of science fiction speculation about a group of radicals who produce a gas that will neutralise poisonous gas. And it's also a strange love story. It was written for it was not published as a book, it was written deliberately as a serial to be published in magazines. In 1930 as well, Walter Benjamin thought in his essay Theories of German Fascism about how a misintegrated technology will lead to millions of human bodies being chopped to pieces and chewed up by gas and iron. So they're in German. Millions of human bodies being chopped to pieces and chewed up by gas and iron. strange metaphor in the sense that gas sort of chopping, gas devouring. And gas emerges in Walter Benjamin's most famous essay on the work of art in the age of its technical reproducibility, where he talks about gas in a number of ways. It taking off from the thought of aura as this gas which is a marker of contemplation, of a dream-filled distance, a sort of horizon line, an atmosphere that makes that which is in the distance fuzzy and available to contemplation. He exchanges that within the work of art to think about gas warfare and this gas that enters the body, compromises the body, that turns the landscape into a battlefield. And it is, in his terms, this gas of gas warfare is a reinvented, synthesized aura. So that's the kind of aura of early photography that's sort of lifted itself from the natural experience into the mediated photographic one, as he discusses in these essays. Then gas warfare is another type of aura, reinvented and synthesized. The gassy appearance of original aura on the photograph, though, was nonetheless a sign and a byproduct of violent inequality. In retrospect, the apparent innocence, say, of a photographic gaseous haze was in truth, Benjamin says, a deposit of economic structure and political fantasy. It is a damp fog of imperial history that threatened to linger on, and that is eventually resynthesized as the killing atmosphere on the battlefront. Every chemical image, every chemical photographic image has compelled fluids to produce a reflection of a crystallized fraction of a second. In a history which began, as Benjamin says in his 1931 description in Short History of Photography, with the emergence of the image, the emergence of the technology, and the emergence of the human, all from a droplet-laden mist. Photographic aura is a gaseous haze that imprints itself on the earliest photographs. And he argues that this technology responds to an economic structure, to political fantasy, to things which are invisible as such as we might call atmospheres, or at least non-polluted, invisible ones. Such a mist was the aura that seeped into clothes, bled into the environment, and was recorded by the photograph as if it were a tangible atomic presence, an idea that has become recordable or touchable, inasmuch as the photograph was held in the hand and met the viewer halfway, crossing that other boundary of aura that exudes from paintings, which represent the untouchable or the valuable. Benjamin observes of his own fin de siècle generation, he was born in 1892, that it was a generation that had gone to school on a horse-drawn streetcar, now stood under the open sky, in a countryside in which nothing remained unchanged but the clouds. And beneath these clouds, in a field of force of destructive torrents and explosions, was the tiny, fragile human body. So that body is maybe no less fragile now, but the force fields and the torrents have garnered different resonances, as have the clouds, which can no longer simply be claimed as unchanged, for they too have their synthetic or at least metaphorical doubles. There's a quote from Benjamin, which sort of it extends the sense in which an atmosphere can become hostile, and it's on the edge between a sort of an actuality, a real experience, and a sort of metaphorical one. So at the point when Benjamin realizes he has to leave Berlin because the Nazis are definitely going to come to power, and he writes to Schulman, "I do not know how long it will continue to be physically possible to breathe European air after the events of the past weeks. It is spiritually impossible even now." So, some eroded things. So moving towards the present maybe. Cloud and fog and obfuscating gases are pervasive everywhere. Each is a name for an unequal distribution of knowledge between self and state, and also a technique of war, though sometimes also part of an art event. Cloud and fog and gas is everything, and all of those things at once. Specifically, fog became something other than a natural environment when it was produced by Ukihiro Nakaya. And this is Nakaya's daughter, but Nakaya, the father, was known for creating the first artificial snowflake. And the snowflake developed into a program of techniques for weather modification that were connected to war and the environmental conditions under which war occurs, specifically the defrosting of airplane engines. Ukihiro Nakaya had moved to the Nomura coast in Japan in 1944 to study the artificial dissipation of fog with military ends in sight. He wanted to develop, because of the fog in that area of the coast, he was trying to develop fog dispersion technologies, and he carried out research on sea fog in occupied Manchuria. Here there was thick sea fog, which needed to be dispersed in order to control the contested areas of the Japanese Empire. During the Cold War period, in the years following the Second World War, and after the defeat of the Axis powers, Japanese policy moved closer to American aims, as key elements of research involved aspects such as the artificial seeding of clouds and rainmaking, weather made to order, perhaps to alleviate droughts in India, perhaps, as in Vietnam, to prolong the monsoon season, disrupting enemy logistics. So one of the emergent sciences of the last 100 years has been that of weather prediction, which has come in tandem with computational thinking, and also this ever-repeated efforts at weather modification. The story of artificial fog re-emerges as a theme in the art world, where engineering atmosphere turns into art fog. As part of this interest in air, environments, climates, and so on, I guess we might include these inflatable structures familiar to us, for example, from the Fuji Group Pavilion for Expo 70 in Osaka, Japan. This was the largest air-inflated structure in the world at the time, and inside this structure of compressed air and plastic, the first IMAX screen debuted. Its structure, composed of air, continuously enfolding in on itself, responding to every wind gust or every shift in atmosphere. And at that same exhibit, then the Pepsi Cola Pavilion, which the theme of the expo was progress and harmony in mankind. The Pepsi Pavilion was designed by Rauschenberg's Global Initiative EAT, Experiments in Art and Technology. And Robert Briere made these nice little floats that moved around with battery-powered motors and little wheels, moving very gently, sometimes giving off sounds of birds singing or voices talking about beautiful landscapes. And as they moved, the floats were covered in this artificial fog, a veil of fog made by Ukichiro Nakaya's daughter Fujiko, and I think that, there's such an interesting lineage to produce this within the context of, for the Pepsi Pavilion, within the context of progress and harmony for mankind, as a legacy from your father, who's been working with fog as part of imperial ambitions. This system, apparently an updated version of it, is now used at data centers such as Facebook's data center at Prineville, Oregon, as a method of keeping data cool, because data has to be kept cool. And data centers are the material infrastructures that sustain surveillance capitalism, predict behaviors, are involved in weather prediction. So if fog is an image for us, if natural fog produces a sense of us humans as sort of lost in an environment we cannot see through the fog, we are stranded in some way, things become difficult or impossible to map. In these fogged environments, which link to both the data centers as methods of keeping data cool, but are also extended into fog computing and the Internet of Things, and the precise locating of things, and in relation to them, the humans that are related to those things. Then fog is at the same time a name that marks a certain kind of precision in time and space, a certain trackability, a certain positioning, but it is not one that is clear to us. It remains opaque for us. And it takes me back to thinking about Benjamin and the quote of being on this post-war battlefield, where you're in this force field where everything has changed, and there's a cloud above you, but everything has changed, and you're within this dynamic space of both political forces, of bullet trajectories, lines of flight, but also mapping and kind of power trajectories. And he imagined at that point gas warfare moving from the battlefield into the cities. In a sense, those force fields that he imagines are now also part of the structure of the smart city in which we exist within this tangle of forces that may not be visible to us, but are constantly operating through and on, and with and against us. Okay, so there's a sense in which we can think about these metaphorical fogs that come into being at the same time, and perhaps congruent with them is also the increase in pollution and ambient fogs, dusts, polluted air, bad air, atmospheric gases which become hostile to human existence or produce diseases such as asthma and so on. The cloud that we walk through daily is a resource for private corporations, for governments, for the surveillance industry. It's a world of ever-expanding unstructured data, pixels of apprehensible content. And if you think about the fog, or if you think about the cloud, this cloud, the new, not so new cloud, it kind of comes to surround you. And you become in the fog, not just the fog of London or any other urban particular, but the fog of pollution, of bad air. Not the fog of too much moisture on the ground, the fog that surrounds us is a blurry, all-encompassing atmosphere in which nothing can be seen, mapped or communicated for us. And it's not just the fog of tear gas, whose profits are soaring currently as it's deployed in various situations of urban control. It is this fog of computing, which a telecom advert, which I find, clearly it's sort of modelling itself on the romantic wanderer above the sea of fog of Caspar David Friedrich. So this is kind of the contemporary version of it. So this fog might make us blind, while many devices are not there. And the fog, in computing terms, comes to be a new phenomenon, a new nature, just as John Ruskin's storm cloud was described in his London lectures in 1884 as a plague cloud or a black cloud that had come into being as a new natural phenomenon, but it had been brought into being by social, moral and economic forces. So the fog of fog computing is worked on in our environs as cities adopt the protocols of smart cities, smart infrastructure and services, data collection and analysis. It is as if liquid and crystal of computing combine with gas to form a turbid medium through which we pass, in which we breathe, a turbid digital environment of the device. An Internet of Things sets objects in communication with each other, and out of their needs to communicate comes the fog of tangles and capacitors, which becomes a network, a smart grid, a fogging that lends itself to other vague uses, to compute power, storage of data, applications. Brought closer to the location where data is gathered, the results, the outputs distributed but held near, not alienated into the far-off cloud, but surrounding us, all about us. We are within it, but it is without us, perhaps in all senses. A fog made in San Francisco, Cisco systems, now available everywhere locally. And then I wonder about the ways in which this fog, which is a metaphor of fog, sort of takes off, takes over, sort of comes to remake language and imagination. How it comes to remake atmospheres, how atmospheres become policies, hostile environments, places where the air is thick with hate. So I suppose I'm arguing that there's something about the current moment, coincidentally or of necessity, which means that these fogs and foams and froths and aerosols and gels and gases, these strangely interstitial types of matter and chemically induced matters or almost matters or quasi-substances which can still suffocate seem to come to dominate. They certainly focus scientific attention, some of them belonging to that class of materials known as soft matter, which exhibits complex behaviours such as self-organisation and assembly. Their physics might be distinctive or capricious. They might exist between the atomic and the whole. Many tiny fluctuations act on their systems to decide the system's fate in procedures known as symmetry breaking, leading from symmetric yet disorderly states into something more definite and patterned. I was thinking about these things and asking whether there's something in the characteristics and qualities of these pervading matters that seeps into our social worlds. And what clouds do we pass through now? The aerosols of virus, the invisible clouds that threaten to, that crowd the atmosphere and sometimes compel us to remain inside, be they those of warfare or be they those of new diseases. These are all sort of recent government, UK government what do you call it? Sort of propaganda or information. You know, this was a very famous campaign to generate a hostile environment in the UK so that people who were deemed to have no right to be there would just feel that they should leave. So this sense in which you can move from a kind of production of environments industrially to a sort of production of environments emotionally or metaphorically, which equally have brutal effects. We might think too, I suppose, about the sort of shifts in atmosphere brought about through respiratory coronaviruses such as SARS-CoV-2, itself a soft matter form, transmitted by another soft matter object, an aerosol in which, you know, the liquid phase is rich in mucin and other biopolymers. So that last pandemic was a kind of cloud, another kind of cloud, manufactured or otherwise, and it moved itself, it reproduced itself through a cloud-like nature. I'm not sure about I don't have the quote, but I was looking at some of the work around the COVID pandemic where they were talking about, importantly, it's not so much the single body motion of isolated droplets, but the collected motion of a propelled turbulent cloud of droplets that controls subsequent travel through air and deposition on surfaces. Okay, I suppose, one of the things I often do is have these sort of slippages, so moving from tangible forms and matters and substances into a kind of poetic or metaphorical version of them, which can produce a kind of quite cloudy thinking or a fog of ideas, and it becomes hard to separate things out. Everything seems to be implicated in everything else, but that is also methodologically a description of how atmospheres sort of grow, and they are between an actuality and an experience, or stranded between a kind of objectivity and subjectivity in some sense. So I suppose one of the things I struggle to do is to try to find a model of thinking that apprehends a realm in which metaphor bleeds into and out of science and technology, and materials emanate or become the basis of thought, and thought turns material. Materials can conjure a mood. Language can generate certain kinds of fogs of ambiguity or condensations of reference. And I suppose I wanted to come though to a very concrete instance, and we see on this image Grenfell Tower, which was a tower block which burnt in London, and 80 people died, and it happened at just the same time as the whole hostile environment discourse was at work, and it was it's a very bleak time in the UK now, but it felt fatal. It felt like the generation of enemies and the extension of death sentences to people. So when Grenfell Tower burned, it seemed to be the turning of a hostile environment against certain people and certain classes of people into an actual physical act. A fog in a tower block, a fire in a tower block in London turned the air into fog, pervaded the air with poison gases. So said those who suffered it and breathed it and lost their loved ones in their scores. It should also be noted that people had been saying for a long time, the foam that is in this building is dangerous. It will, if it catches fire, the whole building will burn. So people knew, the people who lived there knew it, but nobody would listen to them. So this foam was the transmission system of the fire between the flats. And still nobody has been charged or blamed for this act of, as Engels calls it, social murder. Fog recurs in the official report, which came recently, and this report is used as the basis of efforts for justice, though the justice will likely not come in the way that it really should. So I won't read out all of these, but there's this repetition around the smoke coming, the fogginess, this sense of this fog and this smoke seeping, under the doorways into the flats and engulfing the people who were told to stay, not to move. So that's just testimony, I suppose. So a killer fog, a killing gas in the city comes, floats again out of sight. But it lingers, people know it, but it becomes invisible again to public view or social discourse unless people shout and let it not be forgotten. So it is left to a cluster of campaigners to keep this fire and to keep this atmosphere in view. I think one of the other interesting things about it is that the area around Grenfell Tower became very toxic and produced sickness in many people. around there, such that doctors were reporting this parental sickness from a bad atmosphere, a literally bad atmosphere. Yeah, I was just sort of thinking, I mean, this is frivolous, but, you know, these sort of systems for the wealthy to fight fire, using fog systems in posh hotels where guest safety is the number one priority, just kind of brings into contrast the different ways in which people live. But perhaps all this fog, or this foam, or these strange matters, don't help thinking. I don't know, or do they allow thinking to happen? Fog and blockage and fuzz are all just metaphors, illusions, foggy covers. You know, we can become obsessed. I can become obsessed with fog computing and the Internet of Things, and highlight that or think about that. But these are all just things that make possible the same old production, the same old distribution, the same old workings of the system. Trade still flows. It flows on and on incessantly, calibrated to the automatic movements of the digital forces who manage it from start to finish. In London, the Thames was once the route into the city, and products from across the world, from across the empire, would be unloaded in wharfs that still bear the names of their commodities, so Cinnamon Wharf, Oyster Wharf, Pickled Herring Wharf, or the places from whence the goods have come. So there is still Jamaica Wharf, Cochin Wharf, Bombay, East India plantation. These areas are now redevelopment opportunities for gentrified brownfield sites, a view of water adding substantial value to the cost of real estate. An amassing of latte froth to fuel the daily business and keep it going into the night. The fog still rolls across and hangs around the river from time to time, like it always did, but the river is turbid with pollutants. There's now, after Brexit, corporations are allowed to pump sewage directly into rivers in the UK now, and this is causing some distress. But further out from the centre of the city, we have the major shipping terminals, say at Tilbury, run by Fourth Ports and DP World Gateway. And these are places, actually, I don't have an image of them, but they're places that are now becoming charter cities, so that's special economic zones, which mean no legislation need be applied there. So if you work there, you will not be protected under any labour laws, and if you live there, there will be no right to doctors, schools, or anything. So these are these charter cities of the future, an idea from America that our politicians are very keen on. But what's happening in these spaces is that they're given over to largely automated containerisation, warehousing, and distribution centres, logistic hubs. So this is where Amazon and all those providers are. Places for whom the cloud is absolutely essential. So the cloud, or a fog, a new one, has landed by the river. It's, under its cover, the most exploitative work practices take place. Last week, there was a report on the poverty wages at Amazon's distribution centres in the UK. Okay. I think maybe just to finish there, but I could just show you this image from recently around sort of climate protest close to where I live, near the Euston Road, and it's nitrous oxide too. I suppose it's a protest against the pollution. It's an extremely polluted road, and there are no mitigation actions. In fact, they're taking the cycle lane away because cyclists were too scared to use it. So this is a climate protest that's sort of taking us back to nitrogen, so that they've changed the name Euston to used nitrous oxide 2. Taking us back to the nitrogen I started with, whose extraction was for purposes of war. So I suppose this is a different kind of war, the war of the cow on the human. So anyway, thank you for bearing with that.
Yeah, it's wonderful to follow these threads and to kind of speculate along with you. Just briefly mention on a more practical note, we'll have a conversation for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll turn it over to a public Q&A. So just volunteer questions for a moment, and I'll pass the microphone out briefly. Yeah, a lot came up as I was listening to. It's, it was a very non-linear kind of style of thinking that I got into. But I had a few kind of themes or maybe considerations that distilled for me, some of which are formulated as questions that are maybe more directed, others which are kind of just some expansions on what you had mentioned. So feel free to respond to them as you like. The first thought I made, I was sort of sitting with, was on metonymy and atmosphere as metonymy, and the metonymy of atmosphere. I found it striking there, the kind of twofold, the kind of very dualistic, it seems, makeup or kinds of connotations that we associate with atmosphere. Something maybe on the one hand that's rather benign or kind of egalitarian, something dreamlike, something fantastic, but also something that is has the ability to camouflage, or that serves as a condition for something like surveillance, something more insidious maybe. Maybe if there's a question here, so it might be something like what you might associate with some of the kind of staple metonyms, or kind of maybe more kind of global characterizations of atmosphere today. Following, after Bennington's period, after maybe the kind of the Cold War period, seems somehow more displaced, somehow more homogenous, I feel. So that's one question, and I'll propose another one for right now, and then I'll turn it over to you. The second sort of thing that crystallized for me was on politics, atmosphere and air and gas, and the kind of political dimensions of this. Questions like, who owns the atmosphere? Is the atmosphere ownable? Is it the commons? Very interesting how, in the case of Grenfell Tower, so there's a kind of partitioning of atmosphere, or the attempts to at least. We can think of kind of broader discourse on climate change also, responsibility for emissions, and the kind of very obscure task, it seems, of trying to negotiate responsibility, negotiate what a kind of repair can look like, let's say, of the global climate. And then also, I think, questions pertaining to politics around personhood. I was thinking also of the circumstances of the pandemic, wearing a mask, let's say, that kind of that convention that became adopted, and certain ideologies of personhood, air is something shared, health by extension through the air is something shared. then also we saw other ideologies of sort of kind of maybe the different kind of ideal of kind of liberal autonomy of that air or atmosphere is somehow belongs to an individual, is not shared, is fractalized somehow. So I'll propose these kinds of questions and thoughts for the moment and turn it over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, there's not there. Yeah, I suppose. I mean, there seems to have been this turn to studying atmosphere as a kind of emotional environment, but a lot of the work, like what's his name, Gernot? I forgot his name, Bolter or something. It's often it feels sort of depoliticized, or it's like a kind of version of psychogeography without the politics as well. But there's a sense that we can just try to become sort of hyper sensitive to the ways in which environments work on us, but in quite a banal sort of way. So it seems to always set out from the idea, it's almost like feng shui, or in the ridiculous sort of westernized sense, that we can control our environment and it can produce certain kinds of mood or mindfulness. So sometimes even within these sort of academic fixations on atmosphere, it falls into a sort of liberal sense of well-being, and so that's why I think trying to think atmosphere, adding the chemistry, I suppose, back into atmosphere, and then allows us to, or allows me to bridge from the sort of deliberately weaponized atmosphere to the regular atmosphere of capitalism that is now weaponized simply because of how we manipulate the environment. And I suppose that produces, through that I suppose I tried to produce a kind of critical theory of atmosphere, I suppose. And I mean, the same arguments, I guess, do go through what you were saying around personhood and the pandemic, and it all reminds me of Peter Sloterdijk and his work on, which, really interesting work, but often leads in a politically very dubious way. So all his work in Bubbles about the human society is like a phone, is a series of bubbles, and we all share a membrane. So if one bubble pops, the one next to it may pop, and this has an effect. That's the social world. But we each stay in our bubble. We have no wider interest in a social form that's organised around solidarity. It's just a toleration and an ignoring of the person in the bubble next to you. And he loves the skyscraper because it embodies this form of living separately in our small bubbles. So I suppose I want to think much more about, I like the way you put it, the atmosphere as a commons, and asking who does own atmosphere, who has the right to pollute an atmosphere, who has the right to demand it be unpolluted, who has the right to make an atmosphere hostile, and who do they have to get on board to to Cary. I mean, it's remarkable how quickly a mood can change. There's all the crowd theory, the 19th century stuff from Tard, where he talks about contagion effects within crowds and how quickly a mood might move across a crowd. And that happens socially. You generate hostile atmospheres, and people who would otherwise be quiet feel legitimated to be hateful. We saw that under Trump, I guess, in various ways. And it was interesting that early period of COVID where to wear a mask for some people was to be a communist. It was this bizarre sort of collapse of a certain kind of health action into a political action. So I think it's interesting to think about, and it's like thinking about aura, which in popular terms is a fuzz around the body. So where is the edge of our body? Where does our individuality stop and another person's begin? And maybe in a more quantum influenced way of thinking about these things, there wouldn't be these boundaries and these stop points, but there's just a sort of a process that is without limit in some way. And also just what you were saying about politicians and climate change. I mean, it's a horrible spectacle to see politicians, for example, in the UK at the moment, somebody wanted to become the next Prime Minister by saying, I will abandon our commitment to protect the environment. Everyone applauds, good, I could use my car more, So that kind of weaponizing, it's another way of weaponizing atmosphere, I guess, but through political rhetoric, which is also connected to modes of living.
Yeah, I think this aspect of atmosphere as spectacle or something that can become a spectacle seems really potent also. Maybe another kind of example from the US I was thinking of was also in the summer of 2020 was George Floyd's killing or breath, became was recorded, was screens immediately that, and kind of the violence of stripping away of one's access to breathing, right, was on full display, or in other ways I'm thinking of very different examples. For example, like Olympic Games, use weather technologies, keeping certain kinds of weathers away, or promoting snow or something like this. Maybe to integrate Benjamin a bit more as well on the point of materiality and aura. The point in your lecture where you're speaking about sort of cloud condensation or atomic condensation, the condensation of materials used in atomic weapons manufacturing. I found interesting that atmosphere is actually largely absence. It's space in between atomic particles, and it's not quite felt in maybe a kind of dermal capacity so much. It's there, but it's sensed with some sort of other faculty, or not with sort of immediate senses. So I guess on that point, when we speak about the materiality of atmosphere, what are we speaking about? Is it kind of atomic particles in their most, does something to be literal in that sense? Is it something more? Is it something maybe like a mood or affect? Does that come into And how does perhaps emptiness, how does that become part of the materiality of the atmosphere?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, just quickly on the breath, one of the things we're reading in the course was is Jonathan Cary's new book, Scorched Earth, which is a really desperate cry against the digital world and a whole demand for us to breathe the same air, to leave the machines behind and to be in a room together. And he talks about to conspire, the conspiracy as a sort of model of politics. If we come together, we breathe the same air and we make conspiracy because the word breath is at the root of the notion of the conspiracy, which becomes a good thing. It's not conspiracy theory, it's talking together to make change. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. What is atmosphere? And I suppose, is it... There's this amazing line from Marx, who does this speech at the opening of the People's Paper in the 1860s, where he talks about the pressure of atmosphere on each human. And he's reading all the latest science, and he says it weighs 400 pounds. There's this particular pressure, but we don't feel it, just as we could not feel the revolutions coming across Europe, but that pressure was there. And so I suppose partly I think of atmosphere as this thing that works on us, but we may not feel it, but still it is working, and that's real atmosphere, I suppose. As much as the atmosphere of mood or political engagement, waves of revolution or whatever. Partly, I suppose I'm thinking about it through Goethe, which is where this idea of turbid medium comes from, and he thinks of atmosphere as what you look through in order to see something else, and he wants to say that atmosphere, that mediation, that Huber's medium plays its part in the experience of seeing. So atmosphere then is what comes between us and what our attention is directed to, and it plays a part in the experience. And sometimes it seems transparent, but or it's naturalized, and sometimes we notice that it is full of particles, or we see things, like when Descartes sits there watching the dust dance in the light because the sun is streaming through his window in France in the 18th century, and that's always there, but it's contingent whether we see these things or whether we have the moment to sit and see them. So that's a part of what atmosphere might be. It's kind of a container of all sorts of potentials that may or may not be visible to us. I think that's how I view it.
Yeah, this brings up a couple of other thinkers also for me. This point of affect also, Heidegger and Friedrich Dumont, or mood, that atmosphere is something you're thrown into, something that one becomes attuned to, and at the same time participates in making, and there's this kind of co-creative, emergent process of atmosphere. And then also, we're speaking also about opacity and the kind of aesthetics of atmosphere. And this is bringing to mind for me Edward Discussant, who speaks about opacity as a kind of ethical call, that the kind of non-knowability of the other and of the self necessitates a kind of respect or reverence or awe or kind of wonder, something kind of sublime that emerges from the kind of non-positivist, uncontainable, unknowable kind of comportment of atmosphere. It concludes kind of the bulk of my question. There's many other thoughts I have.
I think that's fascinating about glissant and opacity. And I suppose I don't want to close things off, I suppose, and say something can't be known. But I think it's always a provisional and a moving knowledge of self or other. And so I think so maybe for me, although I am nothing compared to glissant, but I like a kind of translucency, opacity, it doesn't let light through, does it? Transparency is just banal, but a kind of translucency where something comes through, I think is where I want to locate myself with, to indicate that sort of possibility of knowing better, but it will always move on, it won't rest.
Great, well, thank you very much. At this point, I'd like to turn over to a bigger discussion, so I can have the mic to anyone who has any questions or comments.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I think some of the last things you said about Goethe is very interesting for me to understand this somehow what we're looking for, because you try somehow to understand better how the atmosphere we are in determines how we act and who we are and how we are somehow touched, and I understand much better your critics on. Generally, I'm also working on this slot that I put, but your critic is on this point of. I think it's very interesting that it's not a question of touching, being isolated, but it's a question of understanding the atmosphere we are in, and this is a quite different approach. And I think I would say it's something like more liquid, more, yes, it's a gas, but it's also liquid somehow. We are swimming into this, and we are trying somehow to understand where we are swimming, or which atmosphere we swim. And so I understand, for Goethe, I understand really very clearly the place you were working. And I think it's very interesting. I was wondering about the use you make with kind of metaphorical. The tool you have in this moment is to switch from this, through Benjamin, from this being in liquid atmosphere, somehow experiencing an experience, to this political. And it's always metaphorical step, a metaphorical step. Or to say it maybe in terms of some magical step, somehow understand magical relations. And so I see very well necessity of this step to be done. And maybe also get further than Benjamin's metaphorical approach that has a very interesting thing to be in a culture where individuality was a given condition. And so he could step as an individual, feeling and living in a world from one step to another. But maybe we are no more in this individual world, and we deal now very much with the problem to being thrown out of this individual clear condition of being one somehow. So we have to think of being more than one. And so on. Again, I understand very well critical consult also on this point. And I think maybe I feel the necessity that this political approach that you need to have in your reflection needs some kind of other tools. And I was wondering about one point that can be an interesting point and a dangerous point. I was thinking about the attempt to make a voter become an individual in legal terms. That these are some of the political tools that has been used in Vermont, and native people use this kind of tools in politics in a very interesting way. And it is used beginning from the individual, say the water is an individual, or the atmosphere is an individual, and turned up into legal terms using the weapons of legal discussion. But there is also a very interesting approach of this that could be that the atmosphere is an individual, is in itself an individual. And the danger I see in this approach could be that the discussion on environment could somehow can also be very dangerous, because we are discussing very much about environment and the individuality of the environment that can become a very bad use of what we are trying to say, practical, efficient use of legal terms. So I see the danger in these legal terms for the work you do more precisely on this good idea. But I think that maybe there is something to think about this other political use that are now in attempt to find new tools in politics, because maybe this could somehow get out of this metaphorical that is linked to the individual condition of the 30s.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And I mean, yeah, I find that very illuminating for myself. I mean, both how you speak back to me, the sense in which you understand this. So yeah, it's about being positioned as a social grouping, as a more than individual within an atmosphere that works on us, produces possibilities, including the relations between each other. And I think it's an interesting point about whether that's more liquid than gas. So I'm always moving between, I suppose, the liquid, the crystal, the gas state, and trying to calibrate, I suppose, the extent to which I find them useful to think through. And I think there is something really here about liquidity, particularly when I'm thinking about trade and the global. And it's really interesting also thinking about this idea of this coming from a model of the individual, because so much of the cloud thinking, the original cloud thinking, comes from a 19th century notion of the individual. So, Constable painting his clouds. You know, they have a sort of democratic aspiration. This same sky is over everyone, but their location of themselves in relation to this cloud is utterly the developing bourgeois individual and what he, for the most part, will need. So, and it's really interesting to think about Benjamin as coming from a world in which to be an individual in some way was possible, while at the same time, of course, his fate is to become one of a racial group, one of a political group that has to be eradicated. But yeah, this thing about the legal, that's fascinating. I do want to think more about that, because I find it an extraordinary political practice, like, to give a river legal rights. It's extraordinary. I wonder if it can only work at that smaller level, or what it would mean, to give a whole atmosphere, a whole envelope around the earth, personhood legally enshrined. But that's definitely something I want to look at. So thank you.
Any other questions or thoughts?
This is short, so this won't go. In your critique, it's very clear that your position is essentially against late capitalism. I don't know if Marxist oriented or other oriented, but you made the point a few times. One was about these satellites, communities coming from the American model, which I don't quite understand, but there's something that I'm curious about. And then that the forces, the capital forces around this fog that we move forward with it's the generative force that allows for further exploitation, right? But other systems also exploit in very vicious ways. So there's two of them on the planet now that are on my mind. One is the incredible system of relocation that happened in China in order to use these liquids in such a way that disregarded actually the fog of humanity, really, and exploited it in such a way that's, I guess you can say it's partially capitalist in its methodology, but it's certainly not substantively so. It's in another system of exploitation. And the other one is happening in the States right now, which is the Southwest river systems are drained, so that they're at their lowest level. And in America, we're going to have to deal with that long term. It's not something that, like, oh, we'll get a good rain this year and it'll fill the systems back up. But that'll have to do between cultures and spaces and economics. Other solutions will have to come forward, or proposals will have to come forward. So the solution, the one that was just proposed by my colleague here, or not a solution, but the idea that was proposed. The idea of making something, this is interesting too, making something a personhood, to give it rights like the river, that's such a great thought. But that's also something that's really embedded in the power of the capitalist system, to be able to try to take an entity, let's call it an object of some sort, and then propose a solution that gives it an identity that we can then interact with as an individual. It's a complex issue. So I guess my question is, what is your relationship to capitalism, and what is your, is it overboard now and forget it, they come up with another system, or is it just what happens internally to you as you enter into these different atmospheres, that's an easy thing to punch at.
Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting points there. I mean, on the first thing, the charter cities, it's just a movement that's been around for 20 or 30 years, and I mean, I don't know if there are any in the US, but they are certainly developing them in the UK, mainly around ports, and as a kind of special economic zone, no tax, no rights, no infrastructure, just pure commerce. I suppose I see it as a how the City of London financial systems in the UK are famous for passing through oligarch money and drug money and money laundering, and there's an argument that charter cities will also just be places in which so much the world's illegal trade can happen, and some of the Conservatives' friends will benefit massively from that. But that's the cynical version, I guess. But they've announced about 6 of them in the UK, including the Freeport in Teesside, which is where the Imperial Chemical Industries industry used to be until it ended in the 90s. So big changes. Yeah, I mean, I would not disagree at all about the barbarism of the Chinese system of forced displacements, and I mean, I suppose from my perspective, there's an accumulative capitalist style logic there that I suppose fleshes out in a different way. I mean, even when Benjamin was talking about Russia in 1927, the Soviet system, and he talked about it as sort of operating very similarly to capitalism, that it wasn't wealth that you got, but power. But I mean, that was back in 1927, and but it's a sort of state capitalist model, I suppose, I think is at work there. So I think my critique does come from a Marxist perspective, wanting a completely different system, not organised around profit and exploitation. How does that happen? And the questions just begin. I mean, there is a question about the technology. I'm very interested, for example, in the capitalist technology of the James Webb Telescope, $10 billion telescope going into the atmosphere, bringing back lots of information, about the origins of the universe. I find it all fascinating. It may all be very much scientifically based, actually, on a whole set of errors if you don't adhere to the Big Bang Theory, but NASA adheres to the Big Bang Theory, so all that money is funneled to a point called 13.5 billion years away. There are other people, argue this is a great error, the universe is electromagnetic, plasma theory, they can't understand what they're looking at, what a waste of money. We understand it because we are citizen scientists in Arizona who've looked at these things, We understand this because we've read about electricity. You know, to me, those are little cells of people who act in a way like Goethe or like Ritter. You know, they're doing science with their own eyes and through their own sensibility. It's tender empiricism in a way, and they're placing themselves within this circuit of looking in certain ways. So, you know, I suppose I have hope in these pockets of people thinking differently, but how you scale that up and how that changes anything. You know, the other thing is just that the system itself is unsustainable, and will just be run into the ground and something new has to emerge, even if we do nothing. But I mean, that's also an awful thought.
I would say something brief, not to conclude, but just to there. I mean, from a Kosovo perspective, we have this idea that if we reach the highest level of organization in terms of human experience at some point in time, which is the UN, let's say, we would be protected by law, in a way. And we have a case where a country which is part of that mechanism is virtually dismantled completely. And there, your ideas about not only gas atmosphere become brutally, let's say, brutally above anything else, right? Because it's all about gas, and it's all about a brutal method of manufacturing brutal violence, let's say. And I'm just thinking if anything changes. You know, if this is only a mere interruption, which we will just pass at some point in time, and we will go back in thinking that this is not a disruption of our way of imagining our lives, and this includes also how we think about the atmosphere, about the world itself, and about us in this position, or even the idea of not doing anything that you said in the end. And but I'm just interested in how you perceive this world right now, you know, from your lens, from your particular viewpoint, and how did it influence your thoughts?
Yeah, how did it influence my thoughts? I think it was quite difficult to think about that war, you know, that it was unforeseen from my point of view, and this is silly because, you know, others knew that was a possibility, that it would happen, or, you know, it doesn't come from nowhere, but, you know, I had no sensitivity to the fact that it would happen. Once it happens, it's almost though as if the way I understood it, the way others around me understood it, was that it was a kind of going back. So rather than a war of the future, it's sort of perceived as this war of the past, but only because there was a sort of rapid idea that Ukraine is part of Europe and there should not be tanks on European soil, and it must be something like the Second World War again. So immediately one was thrown into this idea of a repetition, and then with the evacuations, I had been talking for years with my children who, like many children, have this romanticism about being evacuated. My mother was evacuated to the countryside in the Second World War and had very ambivalent feelings around that. And she was taken just from her house by the police with her sister and just driven somewhere without even her mother and father. Well, her father had been imprisoned as a German, and her mother just had to stand there while they took the children away. And I said, I'd always said to my children, this would never happen again. And then suddenly the children arriving in the UK and living in an unregulated way with people who just said, yeah, I'll have one. So all of that, I think, has almost prevented me thinking about it, because it just tripped up my understanding of how things work. And I mean, in terms of the brutality and the violence and the weaponry, that's horrific, but it's also bizarre that Russia can't win, hasn't won, or, it's, that there's this incapacity. So I don't know if it changes things, because to change then in a sense would say, there's just this repeated brutalities that can break out and we'll never foresee them, and it's just luck if we're not affected. So not a good answer. I mean, in some ways, I became so aware of this technologization within, over years since the Gulf War, in American military technology, from cruise missiles through to smart dust and all sorts of things, but I'm completely unaware of what weaponry is being used on that battlefield. And so I find it hard to even imagine it. It becomes a civilians' war, it becomes a war of evacuated women and children, which is not what it is. And now, for weeks, there's nothing on the news, no reports anymore.
Thank you so much. Thank you.